Welcome to this episode of the Customer-Centric Retailing Podcast, a forum for retail leaders to discuss industry trends, challenges, and opportunities.
This is Anil.
And this is Fabi, and each episode we invite some of the brightest minds in the industry to discuss the future of customer centricity, with topics ranging from the rise of e-commerce to brick-and-mortar operations, to omni-channel technology to retail culture, and how all of these elements come together to create customer-centric retailing. Today we have with us George MacDonald, Executive Editor for Retail Week. He originally started as a reporter decades ago and has covered sectors ranging from food to department stores, interviewing some of the biggest names in the business. Welcome to the podcast, George. Such a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
We're so excited to get started and actually put you in the seat of the interviewee because you've obviously had such a successful career, as a reporter initially and then an editor. You've talked to some of the biggest names in retail. So actually, why don't we start there? You have such a really interesting career in retail journalism. So if you could give our audience a bit of background to yourself and what ultimately brought you to Retail Week.
Well, I came into retail almost by accident in the first place. Just over 20 years ago, I walked into the Retail Week offices to do some freelance news shifts, and then I've never left the title since. I've had various roles there. I was a reporter, now I'm executive editor. I've covered all sorts of sectors of the industry, from grocery to department stores, and that tells you a little bit about why I've stayed there all that time. It's such a constantly changing industry. Everybody engages with retail every day, in store or online. People talk about it all the time. So it's a really fascinating industry beat, and it's full of some great personalities and characters as well. So really interesting people to interview. And it's just constantly changing. I remember when I joined, a lot of retailers were really frightened about the rise of the hypermarket. They thought it would kill specialist retailers. But within 10, 15 years, the future of that hypermarket format itself was thrown into question, as you had, for instance, online rising, the growth of convenience and all that sort of thing. So it's an endlessly interesting industry that's kept me engaged and excited all that time.
Yeah, that's a great background. And I love what you said about your career being a little bit accidental, because I think almost every guest we've had on has said that same thing, which is a great thing about this industry. And then the second thing that you said that I really liked is that you've stayed at Retail Week for so long because it's given you exposure to so many different things. And that's certainly true. You have such breadth within the retail industry, so there's a lot that we could talk to you about. But I actually wanted to start off by asking you a question related to a recent article that was published in January in Retail Week, because I thought it was really interesting. So you wrote that you believe that the retail industry is entering a new era of localization. And I thought that was an interesting perspective. So what did you mean by that?
I think that it's something that's been developing for a while, through the rise of convenience stores, for instance, going back years. But I think it's something that has really emerged during the pandemic, because during the COVID outbreak, when people have been avoiding traveling and that sort of thing, local shops have really come into their own. And by that, I guess, I mean at least two types of shop. You either have a nearby branch of a big chain, it might be a Marks and Spencer, Simply Food or something like that. But more so, I think it's the independent retailers, who, they've been a mainstay of the high street for years, but they really came into their own during the pandemic. And I think that people reappraised them to some extent. They found that they were really good, whether it was standards of service, whether it was quality of product. And so people attached new value to them. They really appreciated them, because they made life easier and more bearable at the height of the pandemic. And I think, you know, so some of that trade will certainly revert to the multiple retailers, but I think the good independent stores that people have had the chance to experience or re-experience, I think can probably look forward to sustaining some of the trade that they have won. I think the other thing is that, you know, I hope we get back to normal as soon as we can. I hope we're able to visit wherever we like, big cities, foreign countries, etc. But equally, I think working habits are probably changed for good. You know, there's a lot of talk of new hybrid offices. People might not go there every day. And again, you know, that probably means that a good local store is probably going to have enhanced appeal. You know, a lot of retailers have built sizable story states around commuting, but you think just if someone's going into London, for instance, only 2 or 3 days rather than 5, that's a lot of footfall that is disappearing from the stores that were set up to cater for those people. And you know, some of that will be directed to local shops. And as I say, it won't all be independence, because you know, demand for convenience, smaller households, smaller baskets, urbanization, all those sorts of things have led to the growth of local stores from some of the big chains, obviously primarily food. But over the last few years, we've seen all sorts of different types of retailers open smaller shops, often in urban or town centre locations, and quite a variety. You know, everybody from pets at home, for instance, through to IKEA that's opened, you know, small branches, for instance, right in the centre of London, not the big sheds that everybody associates with IKEA.
George, this is super. This is interesting. One thing I really get out of what you said is that the good old retail, it is about experiencing, and that actually with COVID, human of this modern society had an opportunity to experience the local retailer, the personal human interaction, because they were available for us. Um,
Yeah.
at the same time, I also see that this whole 80-20 rule, where 80% of what we do can be mostly engineered and process oriented and can be scaled. You can make it robotic kind of thing. The rise of hypermarket was in a way because of those 80% common or process oriented or engineered experiences. And those engineered experiences that fall into those 80% category were equally vulnerable, and they were easily tapped in by the e-com providers. What is important here, like you said, is that the specialty retailers, they are mostly unaffected in the key thing, the value that they were delivering to the customer. It's not changing at all, because when I go to a specialty retailer or a local retailer, I'm going to talk to that person. I'm going to experience. I want to ask certain questions that are very specific to that person. That person, a retailer, helps me in a many certain way, and it is unique.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a value prop that these retailers have, which actually very quickly, when companies or big corporations come in and try to create a robotic engineered experience, they tend to miss that.
Yeah.
And I see what you're saying is that COVID has given us an opportunity to tap into that human aspect of retailing, and we see that again, and we will come back to it going forward, is what I understand.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, you've got there's two sides of the coin. You have all sorts of opportunity in automation, digitalization, but equally, uh, you can't underestimate how strong that human contact can be, or a really good salesperson, a really good advisor. And yeah, I think that will be very interesting in the years to come.
I'm curious because, when we're talking about the hypermarket or the mall or the supermarket, there's been so many predictions. I think this is something that you said when we were just beginning to talk, is that there's been so many predictions in the retail industry. People thought the hypermarkets were going to take over, and then they didn't. And so it seems like in this industry, people are predicting all the time, and maybe it comes true 20% of the time.
Mm,
So it's hard to keep track. But one of the predictions, or I guess it's not even a prediction, it's just a very negative way of looking at the industry, is this thought of a retail apocalypse and this
mm,
thought that
mm.
people are going to move away from stores altogether. Everything's going to move online. So I'm
Mm,
curious
mm.
what you think of that prediction, if you will, if you think that it's actually going to come to fruition. And
Yeah.
if not, what role do you think stores need to continue to have? And I think that ties in nicely with this idea of localization and that human aspect as well.
Yeah, um, it's a good question, and you do hear a lot all of this sort of death of the high street, death of Main Street narrative. I personally don't agree with it actually. There's been a huge rise in online shopping during the pandemic, and how brilliant that we were able to use that, and how brilliant that the retailers were able to turn on a sixpence to really ramp up their capabilities. But what all that has maybe obscured slightly is that most shopping is still done through stores. Stores play a part in most purchases, and the reports of their death are exaggerated. So over in the UK, there have been some very high-profile collapses over the last couple of months. So businesses like Debenhams, the department store
Yeah.
group, Arcadia, the fashion empire, and that's prompted a lot of concern. Now, a lot of people have lost their jobs. Those are the ones we should feel sorry for. But both of those businesses had quite long-standing problems. If you sort of look at retail more widely, in many ways, Christmas was better than expected. Uh, you know, it was not the best Christmas by any means for a lot of people, but nevertheless, far better than some of the gloomy predictions in the run up to Christmas. So I think for stores to work, though, they really need to be at their best. We talked a moment ago about what makes independence good, but big retailers at their best will draw people to their shops. So take one example, Primark. Very strong in the UK. It's been expanding internationally over recent years. It's in Europe. It's in the US. Now, that is a brilliantly run bricks and mortar business. It doesn't actually transact at all online. Um, but when their shops have reopened after lockdown, they have retained their market share. They haven't lost market share, despite the fact that there's no question some of their customers, at least, would have been buying online in the meantime. And so you look at their brilliant shops. If you go in some of their flagships, they have real local resonance. It might be the food in the cafes is something that's popular locally or well known locally. They make their flagship stores a little bit different everywhere, but underpinning everything is just this fantastic machine and brilliant value for money. You look at another retailer, for instance, JD Sports. Again, that's growing pretty quickly in the US. It's made various acquisitions. That's a retailer that really executes brilliantly in store. It's got really good relationships with supplier brands, so it's got fantastic product that people want to buy. So, good shops they're going to be around for a while yet. And I think one of the interesting things that may emerge, people are talking about it, but I don't think anyone has quite worked out the maths and the money of it yet, is new store models that combine digital and bricks and mortar strengths, and that maybe you would measure in new ways. So, for instance,
new formats of the store, and then it goes back to what you said in the previous thing, is that the store formats are changing. We are getting more localized, smaller convenience stores in the urban settings or even in the suburban settings. It could be from a big corporation or chains, or it could be a locally owned, but they would but what you're trying to what I get is that smaller format stores that are catering to the neighborhood kind of thing, right? So as we bring in those new formats, the new KPIs, like you said, should come in, because at this point now, the customer's buying journey is way more complex. It's not like a traditional buying journey that we visualized when we created the hypermarket model. It's not how it is today. Today, customer starts their buying journey mostly on their computer, on your phone, or in a conversation with their friend on social media. So, generally the buying decisions are influenced a lot by many different, channels or sources of information. And store plays a very critical role in that journey, because customer may actually not come to buy the item at the store, but they will definitely stop by in the store to check out the brand, check out the product, experience the product, feel the product, talk to the people. If the brand doesn't have a local store, they are totally going to miss out on the opportunity.
yeah,
So I think the retailers have to come up with the new KPIs for how they measure success of their stores.
yeah, I think increasingly they will seek to do that. I don't just think KPIs. Um, ASOS has recently bought Topshop. Now they bought the brand, but they haven't bought stores. But it's possible, although it's certainly not certain, that they might try and do something with the Oxford Street flagship store, and that's if that would be so interesting if you had a company like ASOS probably working with a retail partner, someone very experienced in stores, then that opens the doors to some quite interesting, as you say, new ways of or new types of KPI.
What should stores really look like right now? Because I think for a very long time, retailers have had this one size fits all approach to stores, and for the past couple of decades, all stores have looked more or less the same, right? Regardless of kind of which brand you were looking at. But personally, we think that retailers have to dare to reimagine their spaces, and whether that means creating a separate location in your stores for online shoppers, or creating a showroom, or whatever works for your customer. Obviously, every brand's customer is going to have a little bit of a different preference. But I'm curious if you agree with that analysis, first of all, if there's any particular store designs or any layouts that you're drawn to, or have caught your eye as being more in tune with the times, as opposed to, again, that one size fits all approach.
Yeah, so I think you've put your finger on it when you said it needs to start with the customer. Um, and so I think retailers really need to be sure that the model they're using or the variants of it are created with the customer in mind and serve the customer's needs. So again, I do think Primark is a great example. It's the bricks and mortar retailer par excellence, because it is just so well run. It's got the right product, perfectly priced for their target market. Sufficiently fashionable. The stores run well. Other sorts of things. Then you go to the other end of the scale and think of someone like Selfridges. Ironically, actually, it's the same family, ownership ultimately of Primark and Selfridges, but two complete extremes. If you go to Selfridges, what are you looking for? You want a brilliant experience. You want an amazing time. It might include uh, going to the restaurant or the cafes in there. You want to take memories away with you, don't you? It's something to really talk about. And they're very clever as well in that you could go into Selfridges and buy something quite cheap, and when you take it away in that Selfridges bag, it's sort of invested with with much more value to that shopper than the price. And it's just such a good example when we talk about all these department stores that have failed. Selfridges, it's been hit during the pandemic, but what a fantastic shop it is. So that's at one extreme. And then you've got a few interesting new types of business emerging. So there are quite a lot of food hall operators growing at present. You think of companies like Italy, for instance, where you're going to enjoy all sorts of fantastic food, really beautifully presented, a fantastic atmosphere. So those are three different types of format. The again, to go back to your point, who's the customer? What is the store trying to do for them? And then the only other thing I'd say is that we do talk a lot of things like experience, etc. But actually, a brilliant experience in a C store is getting in and out quickly. You don't want to hang around. You don't want to have an experience other than the great experience of being fast through the place and finding what you want. So it's really all about, relevance to who you want to draw in.
So, George, I want to touch base on this exact thing on the customer centricity and what your customer wants. And want to just connect it back with the hyper, stores model, where the idea was to optimize the supply chain and bring the item available at the physical store, so when customer comes in they can buy and take it home. But what that did, in my opinion, is it made, or it forced retailers to manufacture much more quantity of certain SKU so that they can have it available at different store locations. And at the end, what it resulted in is that at the end of the season, there were a lot of discounting, clearance, and all that, right? What I see is that there's a lot of hidden evil going on here, is that we've unknowingly or knowingly, I don't know what, but unknowingly we have created a lot of strain on our natural resources. We have consumed them much more, I would say, unconscious consumption has increased and we've consumed them. So what I'm trying to get to is that going forward, especially with all these, retailers being in trouble, do you think that retailers will also consider the sustainability option? And because most of the customers are actually thinking about sustainability and they are aware of sustainability, and also, that how you treat your people in the supply chain, like your manufacturer in some developing country, having employees at the low wages and all that, right? So from that social justice to sustainability, what do you think, how retailers are going to respond to customers' opinion or customers' preferences on social justice and sustainability? Because in the long run, I think we need to be paying more attention to those things.
Yeah, I think those things are really rocketing up the retail agenda. In fact, they're rocketing up the agenda. You can't afford to ignore them. Maybe in the past, in inverted commas, green products were the sort of thing that people might think only better off shoppers may want. Whereas I think now people are in general more interested and more concerned about sustainability and climate change. what they say and what they do aren't always the same. You know, uh, they'll carry on buying from a retailer whose clothes they like and ignore stories that there may be about unfairness or worse than unfairness in the supply chain. But I think what they want is for retailers to make all the difficult choices for them. So for retailers to lead the way in um, taking measures within their businesses to address climate change or to behave in the best way to make sure there isn't abuse in their supply chain. And so you are seeing retailers across the board taking some of these concerns on. We've got the big climate change conference coming up at the end of the year, and in the UK and in the US, you see a lot of retailers have already made commitments to at least match those wider objectives that have been set, or in some cases to try and meet them even more quickly. Uh, and I think it will end up that this will be a sort of competitive advantage for retailers. The ones that are able to tell the consumer honestly about what they're doing on sustainability, what they're doing on social justice, what they may be doing on diversity. That will be something that the shopper will value. But I think at the moment there's still a little bit of a disconnect between what shoppers say matters to them and what they actually do. But that gap is being narrowed, and retailers are seeing that they can lead the way, and by leading the way, actually not just keep their own customers, but win new ones. And there's a lot of aspects of all this too, which are play into changing customer demographics. For instance, in lots of places you might have single households, so they want smaller package sizes. During the last recession, consumers made great efforts to avoid food waste. So if the retailers can help people do that, reflect their lifestyles and reflect what they're concerned about, then that is going to be good for business as well as a good thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's one of the considerations when it comes to fast fashion. Is obviously one of the benefits associated with fast fashion is that price point and your ability to emulate some of the trends that are going on in the higher fashion world, but at a much lower price point. And that's been very popular for a very long time.
Mm.
And now you can see a lot of people discussing ways that fast fashion really kind of is exploitative, and maybe they don't want to support it as much. But at the end of the day, especially in this context, price point is always going to matter, and not everyone can shop at these extremely high priced retailers. So it really is kind of a balancing act.
Yeah.
But I did want to go back to something that you said earlier about Selfridges, because I think what's interesting is if you look at some of these department stores or almost mall-based retailers. Like you have Harrods in the UK, and then you'll have Saks Fifth Avenue in the US, which are examples of department stores that are doing it right. And some of that does have to do with the fact that it's luxury, and of course there's a certain amount of pride that comes out of walking out with one of those bags. But then we also have examples both in the US and the UK and everywhere in the world of department stores that are really struggling, whether that's Macy's or Nordstrom's or whoever it is,
Mm.
Debenhams. So I'm curious, what's your prediction there? Everyone's predicting about kind of what the future of department stores or mall-based retailers are, and I'm curious if you think they're just going to slowly fade out, and it's all going local, or they're moving to the high streets, or they're moving completely online, which I know that isn't the position that you hold. But if you were to predict what the future would be for these kind of retailers, what would that prediction be?
Yeah, that's a hard one, because the reason it's hard is because you said there at the beginning, it's completely right. Some have done well, and some have not only done badly, they're no longer of this earth. So I think there are a few things probably that matter. I think with department stores, online has been a really big challenge, in fact, because you can search however you like. You can search by brand name if that's what you're looking for. You can search by product type and compare prices, and that's been problematic in a few ways. Partly it's created that out and out price competition. Partly someone like Amazon, it's not called the everything store for nothing. It's just incredibly convenient. You can find almost whatever you want there. Um, and the other thing is that quite a few department stores, they built up own brand. Now, in quite a number of those cases, were they really brands? Would the customer in the street have called them a brand, or was it just a label in an item of clothing that a retailer told you was a brand? I think there was a bit of a problem there. Um, and so, what can they do? I think for department stores, a lot of it does depend on the experience. A department store, you don't tend to go there to say, I'm going to get a pair of socks, do you? You might have, there might be some particular things you're interested in looking at, or that you want. But it's generally a more sort of leisurely trip. You're looking for stimulation, enjoyment. You're probably going to pepper that trip with a coffee or a meal and things like that. So, despite all the ravages of COVID, I think in future, in department stores, the quality of experience is still going to be one of the big differentiators and a reason to go there. And so that means they need to be at the top of the game for the other things that they've always said they offer, but in reality, we all know they haven't. So, quality of advice, standards of service, these types of things will make the difference. And I think a few of them are feeling their way. Some are more advanced than others, but some of them seem to be feeling their way quite successfully in that direction. Um, the other thing is they are increasingly. I think any retailer's got to, no matter how they operate, they've got to have a strong online offer, which in some ways might cannibalize some of their traditional in-store business. But as Lord Wolfson, the boss of Next here in the UK, said, he'd rather cannibalize himself than be cannibalized by someone else. So, you're seeing the development of department store websites are more like marketplaces in some ways. Some of them, it might be the variety on offer. Others of them, it might be very, very highly curated, actually, to create a sort of online destination in particular categories. So they can't, let's say they're doing that. So in that case, the bricks and mortar strengths have to be played for, played to rather. If you want people to come into your shop, it's got to be worth coming to. So you really need to go right back to what we were talking about earlier on. This is where the human rather than the algorithm comes in. This is what makes the difference if you actually go in person to a department store.
Yeah, I like what you said there about, the most important thing is making people want to come to your store and making your store worth coming to. And that's it's a concise answer, but the most difficult thing for retailers to actually achieve,
It is.
especially with so much competition out there now, because they don't have to go to the department store if they want to pick up,
Mm,
the latest Burberry piece. They can shop online at Burberry.
mm,
There's so many other online outlets that they can shop from. So
yeah,
it's hard to stand out.
yeah,
I am curious though. We've talked so much about just different challenges that retailers are facing, and there's so many of them right now. Whether it's the pandemic or uh, leveraging stores and not falling prey to the apocalypse or whatever that may be. But I'm curious in your conversations with retailers, or just looking at the retail industry from a macro view, what would you say are the two or three top challenges that you see retailers facing today? What's that, common thread that you see all the time?
Yeah, there are a few things actually that come up a lot, uh, and some of them are sort of much more far-ranging than retail. So, for instance, one thing that comes up a lot, and we've just been talking there about how important people are. One of the hardest things to do is recruit the right talent and get the best people, and that's something that is especially been thrown into relief by the rise of digital businesses, because people with those digital skills are in really high demand, and some other industries and startups and technology companies, that have been seen as being at the forefront of all this change, they are drawing a lot of that digital talent that retail is in competition for. So that comes up time and time again. For the retail industry to continue to thrive, it needs to be able to draw the best people. I think another one that, and this won't come as any surprise, I'm sure, it's just really truly understanding the consumer. We've talked about companies that have gone bust. Um, you know, there might have been a variety of factors led to their demise, but one of the things was that the consumer had changed faster than they had. So I really think that great knowledge of your customer, which these days, of course, you can develop by better use of data, and lots of retailers that traditionally haven't been that strong maybe in data have been making it a real priority, and if you can use that in a way that the customer really appreciates, then that customer becomes more valuable to you. And then over in the UK, anyone who's got a shop, you will hear about business rates. That is such a challenge.
But I wanted to pick up on something that you said a couple minutes ago about customers changing faster than retailers are, and that's we couldn't agree more with you there. And such an eloquent way to say that retailers are falling behind. So I'm curious, why do you think that is? Why are they falling behind, and how can they catch up? Especially if they're, they have their backs against the wall and they really need to make changes quickly. What would you recommend for retailers to actually get on the same page with their customers right now?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I wouldn't want to be too gloomy about it. Some are falling behind, but not all of them are falling behind. But I'd say two things. One sort of very old-fashioned retail-y, and one more contemporary. So Stuart Rose, who used to run Marks and Spencer, had a great phrase that I always loved, which was "look out the window." Now, that to me is a retail attitude. Look out the window. What does the world look like that's passing by? Does your business look like that world that you're seeing? And is it catering for those people that you see through the products and services that it's selling? So that is real old school retail. That's just watching, observing, and acting upon it. But today, of course, there's the opportunity to do that in far more sophisticated ways. It doesn't need to be all about hunches or, misobservations, because you can understand your customers much more deeply if you do it well through the use of data. So again, to look at Marks and Spencer, it's really been investing in data over the last couple of years, in order to better understand its customers, draw new ones, and get more spend from them through being able to fulfill their needs better through that understanding. So yeah, I think those two are the points that I would make.
Excellent. Yeah, we definitely agree with you there. And I think, we can leave it there with that excellent piece of advice for retailers, because I think you're right in that they're not all falling behind. Some of them are doing an excellent job of keeping up with their customers, but for the ones that are falling behind, it's really time for them to invest in understanding their customers and what they want. And that's really at the focal point of what they should be looking for in their overall experience. So as we kind of wrap it up here, I think it would be great if we just end with you telling our audience just how to keep up with you and what's going on at Retail Week that they should be on the lookout for.
Yeah, well, yes, please do follow me on Twitter if you'd like. My hashtag is at George McD. Retail Week, we're really busy at the moment. Just keeping abreast of everything that's happening, particularly as COVID continues to play out. So I'm really looking forward to things getting more back to normal, being able to get out again and go to city centres and town centres and restaurants and bars. So I hope over the next few months that we're going to be writing about retail recovery and lots of exciting things that retailers are doing both in the UK and looking at examples from overseas to really give people useful information, and at this slightly gloomy time plenty of inspiration about things in the retail world.
So I do hope that you'll be writing about retail recovery as well. But for the time being, we definitely recommend for our audience to follow you on Twitter and to check out Retail Week if you haven't already, because there really is such a breadth of information there, and it's actually a great way for retailers to keep up with what's going on in their industry and with their customers as well. So thank you so much for your time today, George, and it's been such a pleasure having you on.
Thanks,
Thanks.
George.
That's it for this episode of the Customer Centric Retailing Podcast, featuring our special guest, George MacDonald. George has observed the retail industry from every angle as a reporter and an editor of Retail Week, and he's confident that only retailers that put the customer first and embrace new store functions and designs can succeed. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Please rate and review and recommend to a friend or fellow retail fanatic. This podcast is brought to you by Hot Wax Commerce.